There are lots of grounds for divorce in Alabama. We are considered what's called a no-fault state, which means that 9 times out of 10, your divorce is going to be granted on the grounds of incompatibility or irreconcilable differences. Both of those things are considered no fault. There are instances of fault divorces, which would be adultery, substance abuse, physical abuse, abandonment. Those are situations where one spouse has really contributed a lot more to the breakdown of the marriage than the other spouse. But even if it is a quote fault divorce, most often your judgment of divorce is going to say that it is an irretrievable breakdown, which means no fault. So proving fault in your divorce can be really important, but you don't need to be attached to the language that is in your judgment of divorce, because most of the time it's going to read as a no-fault divorce. Even if your spouse doesn't agree that the marriage is irretrievably broken and doesn't want a divorce, you have the right to get a divorce for any reason at all, basically. The division of your assets in your divorce is going to be one of the first questions we look at. In Alabama, anything that is considered part of the marital estate is going to be divided equitably. People confuse that all the time and think that it must be divided equally, and that's not the case. The word equitable means fair, and what a judge thinks is fair is possibly different from what you or I think is fair. So when we're looking at dividing assets, the most important thing to know is no matter whose name something is in or who owned it before the marriage, it could very likely be considered marital property. And if it's marital property, it can be divided in a way that seems fair. Fair can look different depending on who has done what during the marriage, both financially and physically. The same is true for the division of debts. And sometimes you may want to weigh the division of your debts against your assets. There may be cases where something that is not marital property is excluded from what is divided by the court. So if you have inherited something or received something as a gift, and you have not done things that change that into marital property, like commingling the funds or using some of the funds for a marital asset, then you may be able to make a successful argument that that should not be divided as part of your divorce. Alimony exists in order to provide some source of support to the spouse who has less earning capability. There are different kinds of alimony. In Alabama, you are only eligible for what is called permanent alimony if you've been married for 20 years or more. Even if you receive permanent alimony, it may not actually be permanent. If you are the recipient of alimony and you get remarried, then the alimony is going to stop. Same if you live with a person with whom you're romantically involved. If either party dies, alimony stops and you can't make a claim against the estate. If you've been married for under 20 years and one spouse earns significantly more than the other, then you can get rehabilitative alimony. And that's exactly what it sounds like. It is meant to rehabilitate the spouse who earns less money or has less ability to support themselves. But it's temporary in nature. It can be 1 year. It can be up to the length of the marriage, depending on the circumstances. It's usually not going to be the entire length of the marriage if you've been married less than 20 years. That would be unusual. The point of rehabilitative alimony is to help you as the non-moneyed spouse figure out how you're going to get back on your feet, to level somewhat your lifestyle with the spouse who you're divorcing, and make sure that if you haven't been in the workforce for many, many years, you're not left with no means to support yourself at all. What we try to do immediately is help you figure out what are your needs going to be after you're no longer living in the marital home? Because it's always going to be more expensive to have two separate homes than one home when you were living together. So it's never going to look exactly the same, but we want it to be as comparable for as long as it takes for you to get on your feet. When you're getting a divorce, the very first question I'm going to ask you is, do you have kids, and is custody going to be an issue with them? Because there are cases where we're dealing with custody and assets, and then we're just dealing with asset cases. If you have children, that is always going to be our number one focus in your divorce case. How can we get you the most time that is the most meaningful with your children? It will change our priorities in the kind of information that we need to get. So you're going to be thinking about medical records, thinking about possible psychological evaluations. You're going to be thinking about how you can prove that you have been giving the care to your child primarily versus your spouse, if that's been the case. You're going to need to show what particular needs your children have and how you are able to support those. Those issues are only at the forefront, obviously, if you're fighting over custody. Even if you don't think that you are the primary custodian, you may want to try to get more than what is called the standard visitation. And so our focus is going to be on showing why it would benefit your children to have more time with you than this box that a lot of people get fit into, which is kind of the minimum amount of time. We're also probably going to recommend some type of counseling involvement for either just your children or for you as a family, because if you end up going to court, there can be important insights in custody that come from those types of sessions or evaluations. If there are minor children in your case, and in Alabama, that means they're 19 or under, you're going to have to pay child support if you don't have custody of the kids. You're going to need to look at what your gross income is and the gross income of the other spouse, the cost of insurance, and the cost of health care. And once we have that information, we can easily project the child support that you're either going to receive or have to pay. Those numbers are going to look really different if you have a true shared 50-50 custody arrangement versus one parent having primary custody. So if that's a question, keep in mind those numbers can shift and change over time. The other issue is if you or your spouse does not receive a regular income and your income tends to fluctuate from year to year, we're going to need to make sure we can support what we think your income should show for child support purposes, because that can make a huge difference in your financial outcome in the divorce. If you have any questions about divorce in Alabama, please reach out to Empowered Family Law.